Hello, class. Today we're going to talk about Chapter 4, which is listening. I'm really excited to cover this part of the chapter, and I hope you are too. It's always interesting when I talk to students, they tell their friends that they're going to take a communication course, and their friends sit there and say, oh, wow, you're going to learn how to be a better speaker. And although that's true, but that's also one side of the story. Communication has a lot to do with listening, and listening occupies a huge portion of our communication interactions with other people. It's not just about what you say, but it's also how you listen. So we're going to talk about how to be a more effective listener in this chapter. So this is the breakdown of how we communicate. You can see that reading accounts for 20%, writing accounts for 5%, speaking accounts for 35%, and listening accounts for 40%. Other studies show that listening counts for about 40 to 50% of our communication interaction. So it's roughly a little less than half, almost right about half. So you'll see that listening is a really big part. It's even bigger than listening. It's even bigger than speaking in a large degree as far as how we spend our time communicating. So let's go over some quick facts about listening. After listening to a short conversation, most of us can't accurately recall 50% of what was said. 50%, that's pretty remarkable. Furthermore, without listening, most of us listen at about 25% efficiency. Furthermore, recent studies have shown a link between poor listening and ineffective performance and poor productivity at work. So when it comes to working in a professional environment, your ability to listen effectively is crucial to being successful and productive at your job. People with poor listening habits are more likely to create positive impression than those with poor listening habits. In fact, think of your relationships. Relationships benefit from the ability to effectively listen to your partner. Research shows that active listeners register higher pulse rates, increased blood pressure, and more perspiration. Now, when we say more perspiration, we're not talking about dripping sweat like you're on a treadmill or something like that. When we talk about more perspiration, it means that you perspire ever so more slightly than a person who's not listening at all. So think about it. What can possibly cause higher pulse rates, increased blood pressure, and more perspiration while listening? What does that actually mean? It means that listening is actually hard work. It's not something that's easy. So some quick facts about listening, and this is important because you're going to see this on your exam, as I'm going to ask you a question, not the exam number 1, but exam number 2. You're going to see me ask the question, hey, listening and hearing, they're the same thing, right? And the answer to that question is false. Now, if you were to take my class that's it's in person, one thing that I like to do is I play a song called Suavemente. It's a Spanish song. It's in Spanish. And I play it for my students for about a couple minutes. And I ask them the question, I'm like, hey guys, which one of you actually heard the song coming out of the speakers? And everybody raises their hand. And I'm like, okay, how many of you listened to the words to where you can tell me what happened in the song? And roughly 30% of the people who heard the song can actually tell me what the song said. And the reason why they could tell me that is because they were Spanish speakers. And so I do that to illustrate a point, is that although everybody heard the song, only few could really listen and recall the information in a song. Why? Because listening requires a certain skill set. And so hearing is simply a process in which the sound strikes our eardrums. But listening is a process of receiving and constructing meaning from spoken or nonverbal message. And effective listening requires knowledge, skill, and motivation. So you might have the knowledge to listen to somebody. You might also have the skill to listen to somebody. But if you're not really motivated to effectively listen to somebody and actively listen to somebody, then you're not going to be as effective listener as you could be. And I said this before, we saw in the graph that it was 40%, but other research shows about half of our communication interaction it consists of listening. So listening is of a high premium in interacting with one another. So let's move forward. What shapes your listening? We just finished talking about, in chapter 3, barriers to understanding others, and ethnocentrism was one of them, racism was one of them, stereotyping was another, color blindness was another. And not only is it a limitation to interacting with another, but think about how certain things interact or limit how we interact and listen to other people. Some things that you can consider would be our attitudes, our values, our biases, our previous experiences, also our culture. So when you're listening to other people, I really want to challenge you guys to think about how your attitudes affecting how you're listening. Maybe you don't like the person that's talking to you, and even though they might have some real important things to say to you, your attitude about the person might color how you're listening to what they're saying. Maybe your values. We see in the news that there is a, I forgot her name, but she was a county clerk in, I want to say Kentucky, and she would not issue marriage license to gay and lesbian couples. Now, despite her boss telling her, "Hey, this is the rule. This came from the Supreme Court. You need to do this," we see that a lot of times her or in this case, her attitude and her values had a lot to do with how she interpreted what her management was saying. Also, our biases, previous experience and culture, all these things interact with how we listen to other people and the meaning that we pull from the content that they're saying. So let's talk about some poor listening habits. So there's defensive listening, which is listening that threatens and humiliates or criticizes other people. I think we've all been guilty of that. When we listen to other people and they are talking to us, sometimes we might feel threatened by something that they're saying, and so we speak up and we have to defend ourselves. There's also disruptive listening, which is interrupting people as they actually talk to us, and that's a poor listening habit. Another type of listening habit, this is one that I'm very guilty of myself, is pseudo listening, which is pretending like I'm listening when I'm actually not. Sometimes when it's been a long day and I meet my wife for dinner and she tells me about her day at work and I'm mentally exhausted, sometimes I just give automated responses when she's telling me about her day. Mm-hmm, yep, okay, that sounds great. Whatever you say. I'll say these automated responses, but in reality, I'm not listening as actively as I could. I think we might be all guilty of that at some point, but it's important to recognize those things. Selective listening, picking and choosing the information we want to pay attention to. There's also superficial listening, and this is when you listen not for content. You listen based on the person's look, their appearance, their style, but you're not really listening to the content or the meaning of the message. In my class today, we talked about that, and I said, have you ever dated a beautiful idiot? And here's what I mean by that. A person who looks amazing on the outside, they're beautiful, they look great. You're dating this person, they're beautiful, but they're not very smart. They have no real content to offer. And in situations where I've dated somebody like that, my friends will pull me aside and bring it to my attention. Hey, Chris, this person is not that bright. And I'm like, yeah, they are. They're really deep. When in reality, they're about as deep as a frisbee, right? And so what's happening is I'm allowing the person's appearance and their attractiveness to influence my perception of their content. And I'm not judging the content for what it's worth. So think about that in your own life. How's a person's style, their look, their flair might influence your perception of of what they're saying instead of actually the content and the meaning of their words. The last poor listening habit, this is not in the book. This is actually something that I wanted to bring up because I think it's really true, which is rebuttal listening. Listening only focused on positioning your response to a disagreement. So, again, I've been in this position before. Maybe somebody's having a conversation with me where they're critical of something I've said or done, and they're telling me about it. And instead of listening to them, what I've done is I've listened just enough to form how I'm going to respond to them. And then once I form my response, I'm pretty much done listening to them. Maybe you're guilty of the same thing too, but rebuttal listening is when you listen just enough to formulate your response and nothing more. And that's a poor listening habit. This week, you're going to have exam 1 this week, and you're going to also have a discussion post. And it's I try not to go too intense on the discussion post because I recognize you're going to have to prepare and submit your exam this week. But on this discussion post, it's about a 19-minute video I'm going to have you watch, and it's a TED Talk with this guy named John Francis, and he's going to talk about how he was silent for 17 years in his journey. And in this video, I want you guys to really pay attention to these poor listening habits. You're going to find them on page 61 of your textbook, and identify some of the poor listening habits that he admits to. So think about this lecture, read the poor listening habits on page 61 of your textbook, and see if you can identify some of the ones that John Francis admits to. And there's a couple other questions I asked you, and that will really be a good thing that you pay attention to this part and also read page 61 of your textbook. Okay, there's a Hurrier model of listening, which is hearing, understanding, remembering, interpreting, evaluating, and responding. And if you want to read that in more detail, that's going to be located in page 62 of your textbook. Key listening characteristics. So let's start with empathetic listening. Empathetic listening is when you listen from another person's perspective. You put yourself in their shoes and you focus on their thoughts, their feelings, their motives. Listening from the other person's perspective. Also, there's paraphrasing. Paraphrasing is one of the best things that you can do to become an effective listener. Like I said earlier, I have a tendency to pseudo-listen. It's a weakness of mine. And one of the ways I counteract that is to paraphrase. So whether it's a friend or my wife saying something, I challenge myself to summarize what they're saying and put it in, restate it in my own words. And it serves two good purposes. Number one, it makes sure that me and the speaker are on the same page. We're getting the same message. And number two, it's a way of kind of giving myself homework, making sure I'm staying on task with what they're saying and not just zoning out. So if you have that problem with pseudo-listening or misinterpreting people, paraphrasing is one of the most powerful things you can do to be an effective listener. When listening, remember to repeat, associate, visualize, use mnemonics. In the books, it talks about speaker responsive versus listener responsible language. I'm gonna make sure that I'm gonna encourage you guys to read about that in chapter 4. It's really good tips on how to be a more effective listener and how to interpret messages more appropriately. So now we're going to cover how to ask the right questions, some strategies of making sure that when you're listening, you can ask the appropriate question. Number one, have a plan. Make sure your question is appropriate. Make sure it's clear. Okay, think about it. Just don't fire off something that can offend the other person, and make sure it's not confusing. You need to weigh through, sift, and make sure you have a good, clear question before just asking it. Number two, keep the question simple. Number three goes without saying, ask non-threatening questions. Nobody likes to feel like they're attacked, and it's really important to do that. Number four, ask permission. Ask permission is one of the keys to listening. Not just in asking questions. Hey, can I ask you a question? But when you're listening to somebody, you probably want to qualify how you're listening to them. Here's what I mean by that. Have you ever had a situation before, just think about it, where somebody is talking to you and you offer your opinion and they sit there and they say, well, I just wanted you to listen to me. Wasn't trying to have your opinion. And you're like, oh, wow, I'm sorry. Or maybe it's maybe it's the opposite. Maybe you're listening to somebody, and at the end of listening, they turn to you and say, well, what do you think? And you're like, well, I didn't know you wanted me to weigh in on this. And you're like, oh, geez, yeah, of course. So asking permission is not just about asking a question. Asking permission, you want to qualify how you want, how they want you to listen. And here's an example. So let's say I'm listening. My wife is saying something, and I'm listening to her. A great thing to do, and I want to challenge you guys to do this, is ask, hey, I hear the story, but just before you really get started, are you wanting me to offer my opinion and weigh in on it, or do you want me to just listen so you can get it off your chest? And in doing that, the person will always let you know, well, I kind of wanted your opinion after I was done talking, or they'll sit there and say, no, I really just want to get it off my chest. That lets you know how you're supposed to listen to the other person. So ask permission, yeah, for questions, but also ask them, how do you want me to listen? Do you want me to listen to offer you my opinion, or do you want me to just listen as a bystander and just allow you to vent? And I think if you can always qualify how you're going to listen and ask the person, I always think that you're going to have a great time because they're going to know that you're listening the right way. So let's move forward. Avoid bias and manipulative questioning. And then last, wait for the answer. And I think that's simple enough. So 6 listening strategies and skills. The first one is to use extra thought speed. In the book, it talks about how the pace in which we communicate. The average person talks about at 160 to 220 words per minute. And we can actually listen at 4 times that rate. It's incredible how much more quickly we can listen and understand than we can actually speak. So in communication, there are periods where there are pauses or breaks, and we can use our ability to process information to stay attentive and to think about what the person's saying when they talk to us. Second thing is listening for feedback. We also want to listen to nonverbal behavior. In chapter 6, we're going to get into more nonverbal communication, which is one of the best parts of the entire book. And it's going to be important to not only listen to the words that they're saying, but to be attentive to the nonverbal behavior that they're going to give as well. Because nonverbal behavior very much can counteract the words that they're saying. Number 4, listen before you leap. So before you take a leap or make an assumption of a person, hear them out and listen to them first. It's a great habit to have. Minimize distraction. I got to tell you, one of my pet peeves in communication is when I'm talking to somebody and they're texting on their cell phone or typing on their computer and they're not listening to me. And maybe you've experienced the same thing, or maybe you've been the person who have been texting while somebody's trying to communicate with you. I really want to encourage you, if you're that person, I want to encourage you to do this. Try to turn off your cell phone, silence your cell phone, close your laptop, and look the person in the eye and give them your full attention. All right? That's something that I always do. It's something that I don't have a problem doing, but where I fall short in communication is when I'm watching my sports games on TV, whether it's football or basketball, and then my wife comes and wants to talk to me. I keep the TV set on and I try to listen. Well, you can obviously tell that I probably don't do a good job of that since I'm really into sports. And what I've learned to do over the years is to actually turn off the TV set and give her that attention and listen to her. And it's minimizing distractions. And I want to encourage you guys, whether it's TV or whether it's your laptop or your cell phone, try to minimize distraction. Give the person your full attention when communicating, because that helps you listen more effectively. And number 6, take relevant notes. And that's it for highlights of chapter number 4.